Hello, this is the Cultural Data Analytics Open Lab seminar from Tallinn University on May 26, 2025. This is the last session in our spring season. And today it's our greatest pleasure to have Maria Rita D'Orsogna, who will talk about two topics. One is the opioid crisis in the United States, and the other one is about saving Italy from the oil industry. And Maria is a mathematician in Los Angeles, and basically for her it's morning, for us it's afternoon. And we will spend the next 2 hours. We will do probably one talk for 1 hour, the other talk for another hour. So buckle in. And the stage is yours, Maria.
Yes, good morning for me and good afternoon for everybody on the other side of this screen. It's my great honor to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, I will give two talks that are very different, but also they have the same theme, like, being interested in, the world around us and social phenomena and things like that. So the first one, again, is about drug addiction, not because I have, a thank God experience of my own, but because, again, I live in Los Angeles and it's been a very, very hard crisis to look at because the consequences of drug abuse are very, very, underneath all of our eyes here in the US. And so I really wanted to see what I could, learn about this, say about it mathematically, whatever I could, try to, utilize my, professionality to kind of, understand this crisis a little bit more. Okay, so here are some numbers. I will not go through all of these things because, there's a lot of it, but, whichever way you look at it, it's been a very, very big crisis. There's at least 24 million people in the US that are abusing drugs at this time. And just to give, just a few numbers here really encapsulate the problem. At this time, the number of overdoses have tripled between 1990 and 2020. And for the past 3 or 4 years, we've had more than 100,000 people dying of drug overdoses in the US. This year, they have gone down a little bit, but still the number is staggering. And I think it is still going to be, in the end, more than 100,000 people. So again, this has a lot of costs in terms of healthcare, crime, lost productivity, and also drug overdoses are the leading cause of death for everybody below 45 years of age. So this should really, really, right, put this into, give us a sense of urgency, okay? There are a lot of, drugs around, and the drug dealers are always, they're very intelligent. Nothing they do is random, and they're typically 10 steps ahead of anything that we can, try to think of to try to stop them. Okay, so just a tiny little bit of history because I like these things, and because again, this is a cultural analytics thing. I tried to, put as much culture as I could. Of course, the problem of abusing drugs is very, very ancient, and people have used, substances to feel better ever since the beginning of mankind. But in the US, one big, push towards this was the Civil War, where soldiers were coming back from these, devastating wars, and they had a lot of pain because they either, had been wounded in war, or also they had some psychological pain. And so doctors had at that time a set of things that they would give these people. Some of them were more like quack medicine, and others included, opium. And they had this thing called tincture of opium, which is now known as laudanum, which has a 10% opium content, and it was completely unregulated. And here are some, pictures of the time. I found these to be very fascinating. And because they were so good with soldiers, they started also using them for, children, for, if they were a little bit unruly, if they were a little bit, loud, and it became a thing. And it was completely unregulated. They didn't quite understand, at least at the beginning, how addictive and, over the long time, how damaging these things were. Same thing for cocaine. They noticed that, some anthropologists noticed that the people in the Andes were very, resistant at the work that they were doing, and they attributed all this to cocaine. And so there was a bunch of, people, chemists and doctors who tried to utilize cocaine in various formats, first isolating it, which was very difficult because they didn't have access to fresh coca leaves. But once they did, they tried to use this for tooth pain, for cataracts, because all these, right, cocaine made the eyes and the teeth insensitive, and it was easy to operate on them. And at the time, this was very expensive, but still, it made it was, it was touted as a very, very big medical breakthrough in different kinds of, medicine. And then again, from medicine, it moved to entertainment. And so they invented all these coca wines, right? These were supposed to be wines with just a little bit of this cocaine. Really, they sold them as a way to feel better. They were considered tonic drinks. And probably the best known person is this guy called Angelo Mariani. He was from Corsica, and he was also, he's also considered one of the first people to really utilize the power of advertisement. He had these very beautiful posters that he advertised his wine. And interestingly, also lots of people drank these things at the time, including the Pope Leo XIII, not 14th, which is our current Pope, but Pope Leo XIII drank this. And in fact, he even gave a medal to Mr. Mariani for his Vin Mariani, which again was considered a very good thing for body, brain, and nerves. And he's quoted as saying that when prayer was not enough, he would use this little bit of, coca wine to, have better judgment. Okay, so it was really a thing that people were doing without thinking too much. And here are just some beautiful advertisement of the time. And you can see, right, that this coca was coming from Peru, from Bolivia, from other parts, and they were marketed in Italy, in France, and the UK, etc. It was a really, really big thing. And of course, how could this not come to the United States? There was this soldier who also had a background in pharmacy, or whatever, pharmacy they intended at the time, called John Smith Pemberton. And he decided to also start selling this French coca wine, or to make it himself, in Atlanta. And again, as you can see, right, it says for all nervous disorders, great remedy, etc. But there was a problem. At some point in Atlanta, even before all the prohibitionist laws, they passed some rules that they forbade alcohol from circulating too much. So he had to invent a new concoction that still had coca, this cocaine extract, because it wasn't thought of as being dangerous, but he had to get rid of the wine. And that's when he invented Coca-Cola. And that's why Coca-Cola actually even later on resisted for a very long time, still today, of course, because there was no wine associated to it. Okay. And as you can see, and what you see here, this is the very first ad in the middle. That's the very first ad for Coca-Cola that, again, got sold in Atlanta. And here it is, right? Syrup and extract, other carbonated drinks. He tried to put into this all the things that he thought was healthy at the time. Carbonated stuff was thought to be healthy because it reminded people of spa, going to the spa. Again, these cocaine leaves were meant to be tonic. And then they put other nuts that also were thought to be, very vigorous for the person. And this was supposed to, help you with headaches, melancholy, hysteria, all kinds of diseases. And down here, this is also the very first logo that they ever invented for Coca-Cola. Okay. And again, here is just all a series of advertisements of the era. As you can see, right, they were putting this cocaine, which was this magic thing, in tooth pain, in toothache, in toothpastes, morphine for, to calm your nerves, amphetamines to be skinny. And at some point in the late 1800s, they even invented heroin as an alternative to opium. Heroin was thought to be more calming, but less addictive. Less addictive than opium. Okay. And in fact, right, opium was the very first thing that they observed was going to be bad for people. This is one of the first booklets about opium, where it tries to tell young people not to abuse this substance because, right, it was going to turn into torment. And then again, at some point, this utilization of opium, right, from these soldiers, this laudanum that I told you at the beginning, it became so widespread that the addiction started, coming around. And they made it, it turned into the wording soldier's disease. These were, again, the soldiers that were addicted on these drugs. And slowly it turned also into a problem of women, right? Because all these drugs were also advertised to feel better for, menstrual pain or other kinds of, sadness. And here is a picture of the time of some girl that is showing her mother the injections from her use of opium. And again, because again, it was all over the place, they really started worrying about all this. And one of the first laws was passed in the early 1900s called the Smoking Opium Act, which forbade opium except for medications, but it left all other variants of morphines, including heroin, as legal for at least a little bit more, at least a few more years, okay? And again, then there were all sorts of, problems that started coming out, even with heroin and cocaine. Here is this one advertisement of the era, they thought that this was, causing people to go crazy in the South. And at some point, they realized that 1 in 100 people were addicted to opium or morphine in certain towns in the US, especially in the South, because that's where, right, most of them went after the war. And at some point, again, the problem became so widespread that they passed what is called the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1915, which was basically meant as the first law to basically outlaw all these drugs. And this, resisted for a very long time. And then it turned into, whatever we know today, that basically drugs are, illegal all over the place. Although some variants of these drugs are still in commerce today. So they still have opium tincture is still sold as an antidiarrheal agent, and cocaine, believe it or not, is still used for as a blood vessel constricting agent for ear, nose, and throat medicine, for eye surgery, and even to control nosebleeds. It's still sold today. Anyway, so again, for many years, drugs were, of course, illegal. They were still being smuggled from, Afghanistan or all these other countries. But in the late 1990s, it was decided that they would try to sell some variant of these opium, chemicals as painkillers, okay? And they decided to invent, and they being various companies, including Purdue Pharma, to sell these things as non-addictive. It was good for pain, but non-addictive. At least that's what they were telling people. And content was meant as a suffix to, say counting, right? Meaning that it would give you alleviation for pain for 8 hours. You could count these 8 hours and it would not be addictive. That's why they came up with the name OxyContin. And again, TV was flooded with all this as really a good way to stop any kind of pain, including arthritis, joint pain, and any kinds of bad neck pain, sore pain, etc., etc. And of course, none of this was true because these things, although they were marketed as not being addictive, indeed they were. And after many years, this problem festered, of course, and this is the map that we have of the US for 2014, which is when this phenomenon of deaths of despair became known and advertised. And deaths of despair is meant as deaths of people dying from drug overdoses, but also alcohol and suicide. And as you can see, right, the number of people dying for a combo of these things per 100,000 is very, very, worrisome. It's very high. And, the heart of all this is in Appalachia, as you see that red, core over there at the right. And that is because it's not a coincidence. That is because these OxyContin people, Purdue Pharma, strongly marketed their products to this particular region, at least to begin with, because they knew that people there suffered from a lot of pain related to their work. A lot of people there are coal miners or do other kind of heavy work. And so, they thought that they would more likely use their products. And in fact, that's where the center of all this deaths of despair was located. Okay.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
Is the guy in the middle, is that Rush Limbaugh?
I believe it is. Yes, it says. Exactly, it says. Yes, yes, yes. Yep. For those who don't know, this is a politician in the US. Yes.
But that is a crazy combination. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yes, 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 right.
Thank you.
Yes,
Go on,
very good. Yes, very good noticing him. Yes, yes, yes. Anyway, all right. So now, fast forward a few more years, and again, as I say, the drug dealers are not stupid. They always adapt to the market. So at this time, one of the biggest killers is this thing called fentanyl, and that is, it came about through a series, and there's books written on this. It's very, very fascinating. So fentanyl is again a very, very potent, opioid. It's considered to be 50 times more potent than heroin, and again, it says over here, at least 2 milligrams can kill you. And that is a really, really tiny amount. Now, fentanyl was in fact invented in the late 1950s by this, I believe he was Belgian. I'm not sure if he was Belgian or Swiss, but I think Belgian chemist, pharmacologist. And he was, he really cared about humanity. He did not invent this with bad purposes. He really cared about pain. And he's credited for inventing painkillers for diseases that were not, or, ailments elements that were not very much given attention to. For example, menstrual pain. He also was a very big advocate for, helping people in the third world who were suffering from, various pain ailments. But he understood the problems of his medications, including fentanyl. And so until he was alive, his laboratory had very tight regulations on how this fentanyl could be distributed. He would not allow foreign hospitals to stockpile on this. But then he died, and slowly the sort of quote unquote recipe, escaped his lab, and eventually the drug cartels were able to, make this at low cost and and widespread methods, and that's why we have this, boom of fentanyl in the United States. And right now, and this is like for a couple of years ago, fentanyl is being sold for as little as 40 cents. It's very easy to make this because you do not have to wait for products coming from, again, from the poppies of Afghanistan or other countries. You can make this synthetically in a lab. You just need precursors, which are chemicals that you can make, and typically they're made in China. They go to Mexico in these underground labs, and again, you can do this all year round. You don't have to wait for the right rains to happen. You don't have to wait for these gigantic shipments of products to come from other countries. All you need is these little ingredients coming from China. So again, it's very easy to make, it's very easy to smuggle, and that's why it is so cheap at this time, and it's everywhere. Okay, and again, as I said, lethal doses are very low, 2 milligrams, whereas for heroin, again, it's like maybe several at least 100 times more. Okay. All right, so now where do we come into all this? Well, I was very fascinated by all these facts. Again, I've read a lot of books. It's, again, quite fascinating just from a cultural point of view. And so I wanted to try to make a mathematical model to study all this because, I was, interested in how does this affect the way that our brain processes stuff? Why, does this drug become like such an important thing in the life of an addict? And in fact, the reason for all this is because drugs interfere with something called the brain reward system, which is a part of our brains that regulates, again, our likings and wantings. So we are primed to like certain things, like food, taking care for children, art, and stuff like that. And we are primed to like these things and to want them because they're good for us, either for our survival as people or for survival of the species, right? Sex is part of these things that we like, right? It's all good for us as a species or as people. But drugs come into all this, and they basically give us this gigantic amount of pleasure in the form of a big explosion of dopamine, which is, again, the hormone of pleasure. And so because the body is not used to this, it kind of rearranges. And what happens is that when we don't have this coming into our brains, that is when the cravings and withdrawals come. Okay. And this is the brain of a person that is using drugs. As you see, what you have here in green, these are the dopamine centers of the brain. A healthy person has a lot of dopamine receptors because there's not enough, there is a normal amount of dopamine coming into our brain, so we have a normal amount of receptors. A drug addict, where there's a lot of dopamine coming in thanks to the drugs that they're taking, there is less and less receptors because the body thinks, well, I have all this dopamine coming in anyway, I must shut down some of the receptors so that my brain doesn't, I don't, I can control this. But the moment the dopamine stops coming in artificially, that is when you start feeling all these feelings of withdrawal and, feeling bad about yourself. Okay, so we did some math on this. And again, I just didn't want to, however, get too much into the mathematics of all this. I thought that a better way of doing this was actually to look at trying to forecast these overdoses over time. Okay, so these are some, papers that we wrote. And again, the better approach that I thought was, better for this presentation was to, in fact, look at the data and look at what the data is telling us for these overdoses. Okay, so there is this wonderful tool that the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Controls in the US, created. It's called WONDER, and it stands actually for Wide-Ranging Online Data for Epidemiological Research, where it basically tells you the causes of death for every single possible cause of death that you can think of in the US. It tells you the geography, it tells you the age, it tells you the state, it tells you the race of the person, and it's, again, a wonderful, wonderful tool. They started compiling this in a systematic way beginning in 1999. So everything I will tell you here starts in 1999. Okay. Now, In our case, what we're interested in is categories like poisoning by all these categories here, different kinds of drugs. They have four for drugs: heroin, fentanyl, prescription pills, methamphetamines, and also the manner of death. Okay. Also, we can look at gender and we can look at the races. These are the four races that the CDC Wonder has. And here is a chart. This actually comes from the CDC. And this, again, just to put into perspective how, terrible the problem is. In the late 1990s, this is when, again, all this OxyContin advertisement was being presented, right? They have the first wave of these overdoses due to the prescription pills. Those are, again, the drugs that you could buy in the store, those OxyContin medications. And here, and it is in this sort of green-blue color, the first wave, that is what it's called. At some point at the end of the 2000s, again, some regulations were inserted. And so people started moving to heroin because they had become addicted and they had to find a different way of using this. So that's when heroin comes in. But then again, as I said, the cartels were able to rearrange. And that's when in 2013, they started bringing in this synthetic opioid, this fentanyl into the game. And that's when you see, right, this purple curve taking off because, again, fentanyl is very, very powerful and very deadly. And these are also some interesting numbers. This is called the crude rate. It's the number of deaths per 100,000 people. In 2020, it was about 28 people dying. In 2022, just in the span of 2 years, this figure rose to 30, almost 33 deaths per 100,000. Okay. Okay, and so here are some plots. We tried to look at this, for example, just by gender. This is, again, the time series for heroin, the prescription pills, fentanyl, and methamphetamines. And as you can see here, right, men always die more than women. But in all these cases, you will see that there's a big surge in the deaths by heroin again, up until the, 2015 or 16 or so. That, again, is more or less when, deaths by fentanyl came into place. And then again, heroin deaths drop. Same thing happens for these prescription pills. But again, the fentanyl thing explodes for both men and to lesser degree women. And also the deaths by meth are also increasing. We also tried to look at this by race, and here are, again, some interesting plots. And what you can take away from this, again, is that everything is increasing. And in particular, we were interested in the year 2020. So this is the year of the pandemic, okay? Now, I will say that the CDC Wonder, you have to wait a couple of years to get the data because it takes some time to compile to make sure the data is available. So the year 2020 final data from Wonder became only available around 2022 or so. So again, there's a 2-year delay. But what you see here is that if you take 2013 as the beginning of the fentanyl crisis, what you will see is that you can kind of interpolate some, trend, some projection. And in the year 2020, for example, if you look at just, deaths by fentanyl, you will have predicted some amount of deaths, but the actual amount of deaths are much, much higher, way beyond, what you could have expected. And we attribute that to mainly being, of course, the COVID-19 epidemic. This is true for men and for women, and it is also true for mostly all other kinds of drugs, like, for example, methamphetamines. Again, prescription pills are going down, also as heroin, but again, the pandemic screwed up on everything, which is really to show that, the pandemic really had a big effect on, drug overdoses in the US. Also, what's interesting here to see is that for men and for racial disparities, what you will see is that fentanyl was, mostly on par between both for men and women. It was on par for blacks and whites until maybe 2017, 2018. But then at some point in more recent years, the black mortality increased a lot compared to white mortality. That is true for men and women. Whereas it's not so true for methamphetamines, which is typically, traditionally, a more, I don't know why, but just traditionally, it's more of a white person's drug. Okay, so you see here that the whites die more of methamphetamines by crude rate than the black population. And finally, what's also interesting in this analysis is that if you look at the male to female ratio, okay, you will always see that for all drugs, this is about 3 to 4 men dying for every woman. And that is, known just because, again, men are considered to be just more, quote unquote, adventurous or, more self-destructive. Women are a little bit more, take care care of themselves a little bit more. And the only place that this is not true is for the prescription opioids. For prescription opioids, which is this plot down here at the very bottom, what you see is that the ratio is typically, you know, a little bit more than 1 still, which means that there's 1.2 or 1.3 men dying per every woman. And that is because prescription opioids is more easier to obtain. You just go to a pharmacy. You don't have to go on the street. You don't have to engage with strange characters. And so that's why, you know, it is thought that, you know, women, you know, tend to gravitate more towards these kind of drugs and then, of course, die more from it. Okay. And the green here is the, so here, all these colors, yellow is whites, black, of course, is blacks, green is the Asian population, and red is nationwide. And green, there's a lot of fluctuations because there's not a lot of data for Asian because the number of deaths is very little. So it fluctuates a lot. So that shouldn't really, you know, we shouldn't really think too much about these, you know, green curves here. Okay.
May I put a question?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. You are showing us statistics, as far as I understand, it is all about mortality. Is
Yes.
there any way to track how many people, you know, how many people are addicted? What
Yes,
is the
that is
consumption
that
of
is
these drugs? Yeah.
yes, that is a very, very good question. In fact, I will talk about this in a in a couple of more slides. That is
Okay.
actually, that is very, very difficult to know because you know, you know, overdoses because, right, they die and you know, the hospital has to give a report. So we know exactly the number of overdoses. The number of people that are using drugs is only depends on, you know, surveys of people,
Yes.
of people that get arrested perhaps, but it's very incomplete and it's very difficult to know this from, you know, because again, who's going to respond to these surveys, right? If you're a really drug addict, are you really going to respond to surveys? So it's very, very difficult to know. There are estimates that, again, they try to relate to, you know, the drugs that they seize, right? How much drugs are they able to the police get their hands on? So they kind of try to correlate that to the drug consumption, but it's very difficult to really know this with precision. And it's even more difficult to know this by gender, race, and things like that. How do you know who is using what? So it's a little bit more difficult, but I'll talk about slightly in a few more slides, okay?
Okay, thank you.
But there are agencies that try to quantify this. But again, it's more difficult. Okay. All right. So now, what about after 2020? Okay. So now after 2020, again, this was at the time that we did this, again, this was around 2022, 2023. And the most data we could look into was the year 2020, just because of the delay in Wonder. So what happens is that in 2020, Wonder also changed the way that they reported racial deaths. So we could not compare this racially for the years after 2020. All we could do was look at different genders, okay, different sexes. And so here is what we could find. And what you see here is that if you look at the solid curves, these are the projections. Basically, we took all the data from 2013 to 2019, and we tried to project just based on, you know, the brief historical trend, how this would sort of unfold for the years ahead. And we went to look at the red dots, the red stars. These are instead the actual overdoses. And you see, right, that in 2020, heroin overdoses were a little bit above, you know, acceptable with what was predicted, but slowly it kind of went back a few years after the pandemic to what it kind of was supposed to be based on historical sort of projections. This is not true for fentanyl. It stays elevated even after the end of the pandemic. It's not true for meth. It stays elevated. And it's not also true for prescription pills. Okay. So everything is still elevated, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic compared to what one would have expected from a sort of historical trend. Okay. And the same thing here is, you know, what I was trying to say before, the men to women ratio is still very, very elevated, except for these prescription pills. Okay. And then again, we also try to do this analysis by state. Different states have different trends. And in most of them, you will still see that the rates are higher than what the historical trend would have predicted. This is for all drugs, for every state. And this is only fentanyl. There's less states here just because for some states there were not enough overdoses by fentanyl. Okay. And again, then, there were lots of, when we did this work, there was a lot of interest from the press. And in fact, the Economist also, utilized some of this work for some of their data analysis a couple of years ago. Okay. Now, what also we were interested in is trying to take this data from wonder and trying to forecast the future of this drug epidemic. Okay. And so one of the things that Wonder has also is stratification of these overdoses by age. And because, right, we know that different age groups utilize drugs differently, we try to see if we could use this information for some forecasting in the future. And here are just, right, some, again, what you were talking before, how do we know who uses drugs? These are some surveys from baby boomers that are talking about how much drugs that they consume. This is some also surveys from young people to see how many of them have tried drugs in the past and things of that kind. Okay. So here is what we try to come up with. And this is just a little bit of math. Okay. So here what we're trying to do is to model the number of people that are addicts, the number of people that are using drugs of age A and at time T. Okay. And so this will change in time. Okay. What you see here at the left is the time evolution of the number of people that are changing, that are utilizing drugs. So, and on the other hand, you will see some of them will die. Mu is the rate of death for people at age A at a time T. So this is a minus sign. And then plus, people get addicted all the time. Okay. So the people that get addicted, this is coming in with a rate R of age A and at time T. Okay. How much people, come into the pool of addicted. And then times, of course, how many people were not addicted to begin with. And the number of people that are not addicted are this big N, the entire population that you have at age A at a time T, minus those that are already addicted. So that's that little N. Okay. So this is a little bit of a mathematical model. And so what you can do with this is that you can certainly solve this analytically. And this is just to show that we can actually do this. All you need is to couple it with an initial condition. Okay. The number of drug addicts at what you consider to be your time equals 0. Okay. And what you need, however, to make this applicable to data, you have to be able to kind of interface this with somebody that will tell you, for example, what is this mortality, mu? What is this rate of addiction, R? What is this initial condition? And what, of course, is the number, the population that you have. Okay. And so Wonder helps us in that way, because again, all of these things mostly could come from, not all of them, but some of them we could take from Wonder, and the rest we're going to try to infer from our analysis. So Wonder will actually tell you the total population of the United States as a function of age and at time. And so this is what you will see down here. And as you can see, right, there are some peaks here, and that's because of some baby boomer kind of peaks that we had in the country. And this is also what you will see here instead. This is the number of overdose deaths changing over time. Also here you see some peaks. And this will be useful for us to, when we go and match, when we go and try to propose forms for the rate of addiction. Okay. But from Wonder, we can certainly take the number of people that are present in the United States of age A and at time T. That we can take. Okay. Now, what are we going to do about this mortality rate? Well, what we're going to do, we're going to take data that has, people have, spent a lot of time, demographers, trying to include, trying to find natural causes of death, or, all causes of death as a function of age. Okay. For this, we have tabulated formula, and they're written down here. And then we're going to decide, because this is the population of addicts, they have an extra death due to, again, utilizing drugs. And it is this thing that we're going to call mu D. Now, to make it simple, we're going to just assume that this mu D is a constant. We're not going to make this age dependent, just because, or else we would have too many age categories to follow. So we're going to take this mu D as a parameter of our model, whereas the entire other form is given as this function that you see here. And the function that you see, right, clearly it increases with age. The older you are, the more, mortality you're going to get. And there is a very, very tiny dip at the bottom. And that is because there is some, infant mortality that, happens, when these children are very, very young. But this is just generally assumed to be the form for mortality, at least in the United States. Okay, and again, this mu d, we're just going to make it a constant, as I told you before. Okay, then we need to decide what is the form of this addiction rate. So we're going to propose a form that looks like this. It can look a little bit, funky with all these math terms, but essentially these are two what are called gamma distributions, and they have two peaks. And we pick these two peaks because we're going to think that these the peak of people becoming addicted happens when they're very young, at the maximum age A max, okay, this again, teenagers experimenting, etc., or when they're a little bit middle-aged, and that is again because maybe people are utilizing these drugs because of pain or because of older, they start using some kind of medication that makes them turn into addicted persons. Okay, and also this matches well with those two peaked in the overdose test. So we thought that this was a good way to propose this. Okay, and for initial condition, we're going to try to estimate this just by looking at some, estimates that were given in the literature by this particular agency, which is the one that I was telling you before. It's, again, a national survey on drug use and health. They try their best to estimate the percentage of the population that is utilizing drugs, based on whatever, service they can come up with. And so we kind of utilize their information to have some sort of initial input for our model, okay? And so here is the model that we're going to try to interface with the data that we have. What we don't know here is this mu d, again, that we're going to try to take it from the data, all these parameters that come from this form R, and that's it, right? Yes, the mu d and all the forms that come from R, okay? And then how are we going to infer this with the data? We're going to utilize something that is called a Kalman filter. This is used, it was invented, in fact, and is used for weather forecasting. And basically what you do here is that you take your model, your mathematical model, you advance it a little bit in time with the parameters that you have, you stop, you match it with the data that you have, and the data will help you correct the parameters that you have. So the new parameters then are utilized to advance the model a little bit more, and then you have more data, so you compare and you adjust the parameters again, and that's when you keep on going. And at some point, you won't have data anymore because you're trying to forecast for the future, and so you're able to let your model go a little bit ahead. So, this is good for forecasting on the short-term horizon, okay? And so we did that here. And so, for example, in doing all this, one to also, again, return some of the parameters that you're trying to look for. And one of them that we, made what made the filter identify was this mu d. And what you see, this is the mortality due to drugs. What you see is that if in the year 1999, it was about 20 persons times 10 to the minus 2 per year, it turns out to be like, 14 in the year 2022, okay? Or if you like 0.2 to 1.4. So it rose by 7 times. This means that at least, interfacing the data with the model, that the mortality of these drugs has increased by 7 times, which is in line with the idea, again, that the drugs have become more potent. And also from our model, we find that mortality from overdoses, which is this mu d, it surpasses the regular mortality of the country for until age 50. Okay. Again, this also goes well with what people have been positing in the press, that again, drug overdoses are the main cause of death until age 45. And also we find that the age of the peaks that we find here, this Amax1 and Amax2, both of them are decreasing as time goes by, which means that kids are getting, are getting addicted younger and younger. And also, right, also for adults, this age is kind of, becoming lower as, time passes over the time horizon. Okay. And here are also our forecasting. So what we could do, we used our forecasts until the year 2020 or 2019, I believe. And we can match it with real data because we had the data. And so, right, for example, this is our forecast for year 2001, which is the red, based on data up to the year 2000, which is based only on 1 year, essentially, which is 1999. And then we went to match it with the real observation, and it works, relatively well. And again, up until the year 2020, we could do this with comparing with the real data, actually 2021, because data was available. From 2021 onwards, we didn't have the data because, again, Wonder didn't give it to us. So we could only utilize here here our projections and compare them with past data. So this is what our forecasting method predicted, that in 2022 we would have an even more higher increase compared to overdoses in 2020 and 2021. And in 2023, things would start kind of leveling off, and maybe in 2024 we would have a slight decrease. And more or less, all these things, sort of, a little bit came to pass. So it kind of, was a little bit useful. And then also, again, we could do this also from a county point of view, and I will not get into this, but just to show you here that the problem, is very, very acute, especially in, specific counties. And again, just to show you, in 2000, right, the scale of crude rates stops at 16, whereas in the year 2020, the scale of crude rates goes all the way up to 160, okay? And so again, we also try to look at the counties with the most overdose deaths in absolute number, and this is always going to be the biggest counties because they have the most people. But what's more interesting is the crude rate, the number of people that die per 100,000. And here you can see, right, that the worst counties are all in that pocket over there of Appalachian, West Virginia, and here in Kentucky in recent years. Okay, I think I will stop here just because in the interest of time. So if there are questions or if there is anything that we can talk about, this is where we will, I think is a good place to stop. Okay. And so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Super cool. We did clap. What we learned last week is actually that clapping on Zoom doesn't work.
No, I didn't hear anything.
Exactly. It's because it has a really cool sort of audio filter. I surmise there are questions. I have questions which I'm very itchy about, actually. One thing, this overdose thing, is interestingly correlated with creativity over human age. Like if you look at what people produce, they also start around 20. There's a high at 35. Then they sort of have a sort of sustain and release thing. And the other thing is, it looks like a attack, sustain, release envelope on a electronic music synthesizer. So that is a really crazy notion, which I think would be interesting to, obviously we probably can solve, which would be interesting to analyze, is sort of taking too many drugs correlated with sort of the cognitive load people have over their lifetime, for example.
Okay, I don't know, how to, it's a difficult question for me. All I will say is that I think that what you're saying, right, the period of creativity is highest between 20 and 35. Well, that's in some sense also a period of experimentation, right? And that's when, people in their young teens start experimenting. It's just right. And so maybe, you're in this, I mean, I have never taken drugs, so I don't know how to, sort of, put myself in this particular, situation. But what I think, right, again, is that, again, as I said, it's a time of great experimentation. And so maybe, if you are, I mean, if you do this in a way that, you can sort of make the things work together, they kind of go hand in hand. But at some point, this can get really out of hand. And then that's when you just become an addict and, there's no creativity anymore because all of your creativity is going towards getting the next dose and that's it. And there are a lot of studies that even show that, I mean, it's very, very difficult to do this just because drugs are very addictive, but there seem to be a very, very small number of people that are able to be long-term, like, for example, heroin consumers, but they are so regimented and so self-controlled that they're able to do this, just once a week and sustain this, forever. And they don't really become quote unquote addicts in the way that we commonly understand this. The New York Times had an article about this some years ago. But again, I think it's very, very difficult to do this just because of human nature and just because of the nature of these drugs. And I think personally that maybe it was easy to do this for less potent types of drugs, but things like fentanyl, it's very, very difficult, I think, to have any control over this. It really, from what I've seen, it really overtakes your life.
Okay. Thank you very much. I need to probably caveat what I said. This comparison comes out of a work which we did, and it's not ready for publication, but there's a plot where we accumulate over time that looks very, very, very similar, which is sort of uncanny. So this is definitely something where, thank you very much, I will totally look into. What you just said at the end, Is it true that we go from a sort of like, could be imagined as like we're going from drugs that are more like second order phase transition, where you sort of like it becomes bad and then you die, to like first order, where you take them and you die, basically. Is that something where this criticality sort of like goes up between taking the drug, being really heavily addicted, and getting an overdose, that this onset is sort of something, not only the number and the potency, but also sort of like the whole career of drug addicts? Is that getting shorter, or like how?
Yes, again, it's all because it's all because of the potency of the drugs, essentially. Again, first of all, I've read someplace that the chance of you getting rid completely of when you're utilizing fentanyl, the chance of you overcoming this is like 2%, which is very, very little. 2% only of people will be able to kick this habit away. Most of them will die. And that again is because of the potency of the drugs. And also, it must be said that for whatever reason, the first age of experimenting has been going down for a very, very long time, and people
I'm
are
sorry, but it is a little bit, I think, in disagreement with your actual your actual output of your model, because you said that your excess, well, in the old times, your excess death rate because of drug use is 2 to the power 2,000 2 multiplied by 10 to the -3 per year, which means that actually in 5 years time in 50 years time person has like 10% probability of dying from drugs, and essentially 90% probability of dying from something else. And even with this increased probability, you are not certain to die from this. Even so your probability of dying in 10 years is, according to your own numbers, 14%, which doesn't rhyme well with the idea that drug addicts' lives are getting very short.
Well,
They should
it
die mostly of in your model. They should mostly die of in your model they don't relapse. That's true, but they should mostly die of general causes.
Well, I mean, first of all, this mu-D that we had over there, that was, sort of a cumulative for all ages. And so, right, it was kind of also spread out. But also, there is, the age of starting to use these drugs is becoming lower and lower. And so this also will contribute to the, the fact that people will, teenagers are using drugs at a younger and younger age, and it's very, maybe there is a chance that you can live longer, but this is a lot of young people are taking drugs for the first time and dying immediately because they don't know what is into their
several questions here. One, what is actually happening with the age? Because, for example, we know that in many places, young people becoming less experimentative. Yes, people are drinking less, at least, for example, in the UK, and I think in Europe as well. And in early ages, they have less sex. They participate in less criminal activities. Is it true that, and I think that I've seen evidence that they actually smoke marijuana much less than the generation of which is the sort of Gen X generation or baby boomer generation. Is it true that using of opioids in America is getting younger, or is there any evidence of that?
Yes, there is evidence of that, and the United States, as far as I know, the amount of, I mean, in super recent years, it is also true that, you know, for example, this past year, the number of overdoses has decreased, and also the number of teenagers that are experimenting is starting to decrease. But this was not the case, you know, for the early 2000s, the early 2010s, when you know, the dangers of all this was not well known. You know, it is a fact that there was a lot of these pills that were being sold, you know, young children trying to use these things. It really was a very big problem in the United States. So the age of first use was decreasing for a very, very long time. And only now, because people are talking about it a lot, you know, things are sort of starting to change a little bit. But it's a very recent phenomenon. I can't hear you.
Okay, and now?
Yes, now I can.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Basically, the question is that indeed well, at least from what I've read in general newspapers, in the last couple of years, or maybe the last year, the number of fentanyl deaths is going down quite dramatically, and nobody seems to understand why. Do you have any comment on that? And
Yes, okay.
does your model have anything to say about this?
So, oh yeah, so we didn't, okay, we stopped doing all this until the year 20, the last batch of data that we fed into the model was the year 2022, I believe. So a couple of things about that. One is that, yes, so the number of drugs of fentanyl is only going down, it started going down, I think this year. It actually, the peak overdoses was 2022. That was the highest number of overdoses. It decreased a little bit in 2023, and they think a little bit more in 2024, although again, data is not final for 2024. We don't know exactly. But even if it's decreased, it's still a gigantic number, meaning in 2023, it was still more than 100,000 people. So it decreased a little bit, but not dramatically at all from the peak of 2022. And 2022 is believed to be peak, maybe because of, you know, still the effects of the pandemic, unclear. Or maybe again, now people are more aware of this. I don't know. But again, it's true that it's been decreasing, but not by a lot. Now, in regards to our model, we did not train this. We did not utilize, you know, we basically stopped this analysis in 2022 just because, you know, we moved on to other things. But what I will say is that this Kalman filter is very, very good at picking up trends and projecting them for the future. For example, nobody could have predicted, just on the basis of even the Kalman filter, what was going to happen in the year 2020. That was off the charts from anything that one could have, you know, predicted. And I showed you at the beginning, based on historical data, because, right, nobody knew that the pandemic was going to come. So, of course, for year 2020, our method does not give good predictions just because, again, it was an anomaly. But once you feed the year 2020 into the filter and you try to make projections for 2021, then it starts, you know, it becomes better. And it actually doesn't take many, many years of feeding into the system to have good projections for the near future. So this is a very, in some sense, it's a very powerful tool. Even if you have 1 year of, you know, some, you know, correction, the year after it is able to, you know, give you good predictions, although it's being trained on the year before and all the years behind it. So it's able to really pick up the past year, which, you know, to give it more weight than the years before that.
Okay, and I just round up my questions on a more policy-minded thing. Actually, well, basically there is at least an opinion that this war on drugs thing miserably failed for the last several decades. That people tried to eradicate drug use by criminalizing it all over the board, and it seems to be working well. At least in recent years, especially in the United States, it seems to be working very badly. So my question is, what do you think? Is it the problem that more enforcement is needed, or is it the problem that the whole concept is wrong and maybe something like strongly taxing and making it legal and taxing and regulating it is a more productive way?
Okay, this is just my opinion, right? And all this is the following. I believe everything starts with parental engagement, telling the kids that this is bad for you. And that is, I think, where the war on drugs should really begin and be fought, you know, to tell the kids you don't need this. I go around telling this to kids in schools. You want to feel good about yourself, you have a problem, read a book, go for a walk in nature, do something that makes you feel good in a healthy way. You don't need any of these substances. By the time I
Just
think
say
it
no,
moves,
as Nancy
huh?
Wilkins. This approach, as far as I know, is very related to late First Lady Nancy Reagan, who suggested
Well,
just say
perhaps, but
no.
again, I think that that's where it all starts. I think, right? If you don't tell anything to the young generation, how will they know? I think this is the place to start. I have seen, I live, okay, I live in Santa Monica. We have all these, cannabis dispensaries. I'm even part of this cannabis center at UCLA. And only now people are starting to correlate excessive use. Like, because again, look, as I was saying before, if you are able to control this, maybe there's a way to live with it, but it's very difficult. And so what happens is that, you know, it's very easy, at least from what I see in the United States, to, you know, and again, because marijuana today is not the same as it used to be 40 years ago, they put additives in this. And so it's very easy for people to lose control. And now they have these, you know, elevated levels of, psychotic behaviors in people just because of, you know, the excessive amount of even cannabis that they're using. So again, I do not know what the question is, what the answer is, but I really believe that, again, education should, you know, at least help with, I mean, in some ways, that's how, you know, I have, you know, I think that, again, the way that it happened with me, I mean, I can only look at my own life. If I look for anecdotes, you know, my parents instilled all this in me, and I never touched any kind of drug. So I think that, again, education goes a long way. Also, again, seeing all these things on the street. Look, you see them with your eyes in LA. Whenever you know, it's a terrible thing to witness. I don't know if you guys have ever seen people, you know, in the thralls of fentanyl. They're bent over. There's a place in, I don't know if this made it to the European screens, a place in Philadelphia called Kensington. They're all there lined up. They're all in this zombie state. It is a terrible thing to witness. And I think, you know, showing this to young kids, it's just, you know, terrifying. So, and again, and as I said it even at the beginning, there is no way we're going to be able to, utilize enforcement against this, because again, the drug dealers are always 10 steps ahead. We try to have regulation for some kind of drugs, and they come up with something that is 10 times more potent. So it is, you know, not a thing probably that will be solved with, you know, all these.
Wait. Okay, sorry. Like let me round it. Thank you very much. Let me round it off because we sort of hit the hour.
Okay.
But I think there's a really good loop to sort of like cultural data analytics in a sort of more long-term sense, which you started out in the beginning, which is really, really cool, with this sort of like deep history of like how opioids became widespread in society, like new opioids, you could say, came widespread in society and eventually were banned, but obviously it's kept growing. One of the interesting things that struck me as a sort of art historian and somebody who's interested in the history of innovation, the 19th century have this sort of like, you know, exponential growth of new stuff where people, very similar to, you know, sort of like somebody blowing up lots of rockets before like actually getting one to orbit. There was these things like they used pure sulfur to sort of like isolate iron as the anchors for buildings and stuff like that. And then in World War II, when the bombs hit these buildings, water came in, and now sulfuric acid obviously is sort of like coming out of these buildings, because using sulfur instead of tar, which they used for 2,000 years, just, is not the thing you should have. But somebody found it hip in the 19th century. And that sort of like Mariani style coca wine seems to be a similar thing. It's like we buy a tonic because it has a cool bottle, and then like, everybody drinks spritz and Venice, and then it's like, can't be bad because everybody does it, like that kind of thing, right? And sort of then this rolls out. But what I think is important regarding this is that this is sort of like piggybacking on the exponential growth of cultural products and also the variety of cultural products. And you have shown two plots, or like one plot, which this struck me as something where maybe these two sort of approaches of like looking at culture qualitatively and your mathematical model can actually come together. So if you could go back, I think it was like sort of in the middle of your slides where you had the exponential growth a little bit further.
Back or ahead?
I think it actually, you can go a little, you could leave this or a little further, actually. Actually, leave this. This was great. So in the upper right corner on the fentanyl, if you compare this with methamphetamines, one of the interesting things is that you have these two data points in 2020 where sort of the actual death exceed sort of like your prediction, which is seemingly a sort of linear prediction for fentanyl. There is this one data point that's above the line, also somewhere in the middle in 2017. So if you could go back to the plot without your model, then the effect that I'm after is actually more visible. So if you go back 2 more slides, I think.
Back 2 more slides?
Yeah, or maybe 3.
There were no more plots after that.
Okay, then
I'll go the other way. I'll go the other way.
Yeah,
This?
yeah, this one, exactly. Sorry. So if you take the lower 2 plots, right? So for meth, it's very clearly a sort of clean, sort of like more or less exponential growth. And then you have your lag at the very end where you sort of like the data is not fully in, right? I surmise. But the curve, if you sort of surmise this exponential growth, is sort of smooth. While on the fentanyl side, there's this kink, right? And so one of the interesting things that happens in these kind of like exponential trajectories, that if we sort of like trend them out, like if you trend the exponential out, we can still some residual, and the residual typically sort of tells us something about like that something happens at a particular time. For example, there may be a general acceleration, but something happens in 2017, and then sort of like whoever's riding on that exponential growth has to sort of adjust. So could it be that fentanyl, getting it into the people, was harder in 2017, and for the drug dealers, they had to catch up, for example, or something? So in other words, if you take into account this sort of periodicity that is in addition to the exponential, would that sort of like allow us to sort of like have a better prediction of what's going on right now? And how would we find, like, how do we identify, and I think this is a more general problem, these kind of kinks in these kind of like distributions? Because one of the things in cultural data analytics that is sort of like salient is there is quantitative patterns, but then there is particular things like, why did Florence tank? Why did Paris tank relative to New York, relative to what's now going on in Shenzhen? Is not something you will ever get out of a mathematical model. It was a particular thing that happened, and therefore it's not as cool anymore, even though the distribution of cities and the rank stability, for example, may still be a quantitative pattern. So do you know, that's like the simple question, what happened in 2017? Because that kink is actually quite pronounced in a sense, right? I mean, obviously we could ask the question, how many standard deviations is beyond the expectation, but still.
I did not look into that. But again, these are, you know what I mean? Like there's many, as you said, fluctuations, facts that can happen. And so the kink, the 27, 14, 15, 6, this is just point over here.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just put it a little bit further below, then it kind of, all continues smoothly. So it's just, it's very difficult to really tell exactly what happened, that particular point should be above. But again, this is also, again, it's all very stochastic. So who knows, maybe that year, you know, there were more, I don't know, the drug quality that came in was a little bit worse than what it normally was, right? Like, it's very difficult to say. Or maybe, you know, also, again, you have to also, you know, how do they decide that a person died of fentanyl, right? This happens in the hospital. There's a doctor that has to write a certificate. So maybe, right, there are some changes to the medical categorization. It's very hard to, you know, be able to tell with this level of detail what is happening. I think the more important thing is, right, again, to show that, you know, overall there is, you know, this ongoing, you know, dramatic overall trend. And certainly there is a very bad acceleration that has happened in 2020, right? And that is clearly, right, a big jump that we can, you know, we don't even know if this can be attributed to the pandemic. Of course, I think it is, and it's the thing that makes the most sense. But, you know, there is nothing really that tells you that this is definitely due to the pandemic. So it's very difficult to relate all these things.
So this is sort of something where, would you agree that there's a certain issue going on? Obviously, we need the domain expertise and we need the math, basically, in order to characterize these sort of time series. And I always have the feeling in culture, people talk a lot about networks. Now they talk a lot about embeddings, like, you know, the more complicated stuff, but still you get an application, you click the button, it does an embedding with machine learning, and then you look at a nice UMAP picture. While time series almost look boring in their simplicity, but there is a lot of things going on. And sort of segregating sort of signal from noise and sort of like, you know, unique things that may still sort of like do something interesting, how we look at the data. This is certainly, I think, the future in the very same way it was the future in biology and it was the future in financial time series. So we're probably like in 1985, basically for cultural data analytics. And thank you very much for giving us this really, really cool example.